Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, Stieg Larsson.
Chapter 27. Friday, July 15th. Judge Iverson banged his gavel at 12:30 and decreed that district court proceedings were thereby resumed. He noticed that a third person had appeared at Advocate Giannini's table. It was Holger Palmgren, in a wheelchair. "Hello, Holger," Judge Iverson said. "I haven't seen you in a courtroom in quite a while." "Good day to you, Judge Iverson. Some cases are so complicated that these younger lawyers need a little assistance." "I thought you had retired." "I've been ill, but Advocate Giannini engaged me as assistant counsel in this case." "I see." Giannini cleared her throat. "It is germane to the case that Advocate Palmgren was until his illness Lisbeth Salander's guardian." "I have no intention of commenting on that matter," Judge Iverson said. He nodded to Giannini to begin, and she stood up. She had always disliked the Swedish tradition of carrying on court proceedings informally while sitting around a table, almost as though the occasion were a dinner party. She felt better when she could speak standing up. "I think we should begin with the concluding comments from this morning. Dr. Teleborian, what leads you so consistently to dismiss as untrue everything that Lisbeth Salander says?" "Because her statements so obviously are untrue," replied Teleborian. He was relaxed. Giannini turned to the judge. "Judge Iverson, drive. Teleborian claims that Lisbeth Salander tells lies and that she fantasizes. The defense will now demonstrate that every word in her autobiography is true. We will present copious documentation, both visual and written, as well as the testimony of witnesses. We have now reached the point in this trial when the prosecutor has presented the principal elements of his case. We have listened, and we now know the exact nature of the accusations against Lisbeth Salander." Giannini's mouth was suddenly dry, and she felt her hands shake. She took a deep breath and sipped her mineral water. Then she placed her hands in a firm grip on the back of the chair so that they would not betray her nervousness. "From the prosecutor's presentation we may conclude that he has a great many opinions but a woeful shortage of evidence. He believes that Lisbeth Salander shot Carl Magnus Lundin in Stallerholmen. He claims that she went to Gosseberga to kill her father. He assumes that my client is a paranoid schizophrenic and mentally ill in every sense. And he bases this assumption on information from a single source. To wit, Drive. Peter Teleborian." She paused to catch her breath and forced herself to speak slowly. "As it now stands, the case presented by the prosecutor rests on the testimony of Dr. Teleborian. If he is right, then my client would be best served by receiving the expert psychiatric care that both he and the prosecutor are seeking." Pause. "But if Dr. Teleborian is wrong, this prosecution case must be seen in a different light. Furthermore, if he is lying, then my client is now, here in this courtroom, being subjected to a violation of her civil rights, a violation that has gone on for many years." She turned to face Ekstrom. "What we shall do this afternoon is to show that your witness is a false witness, and that you as prosecutor have been deceived into accepting these false testimonies." Teleborian flashed a smile. He held out his hands and nodded to Giannini, as if applauding her presentation. Giannini now turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I will show that Dr. Teleborian's so-called forensic psychiatric investigation is nothing but a deception from start to finish. I will show that he is lying about Lisbeth Salander. I will show that my client has in the past been subjected to a gross violation of her rights. And I will show that she is just as sane and intelligent as anyone in this room." "Excuse me, but," Ekstrom began. "Just a moment," she raised a finger. "I have for 2 days allowed you to talk uninterrupted. Now it's my turn." She turned back to Judge Iverson. I would not make so serious an accusation before the court if I did not have ample evidence to support it. By all means, continue, the judge said. But I don't want to hear any long-winded conspiracy theories. Bear in mind that you can be charged with slander for false statements that are made before a court. Thank you. I will bear that in mind. She turned to Teleborian. He still seemed entertained by the situation. The defense has repeatedly asked to be allowed to examine Lisbeth Salander's medical records from the time when she, in her early teens, was committed to your care at St. Stephen's. Why have we not been shown those records? Because a district court decreed that they were classified. That decision was made out of solicitude for Lisbeth Salander, but if a higher court were to rescind that decision, I would naturally hand them over. Thank you. For how many nights during the 2 years that Lisbeth Salander spent at St. Stephen's was she kept in restraints? I couldn't recall that offhand. She herself claims that it was 380 out of the total of 786 days and nights she spent at St. Stephen's. I can't possibly answer as to the exact number of days, but that is a fantastic exaggeration. Where do those figures come from? From her autobiography. And you believe that today she is able to remember accurately each night she was kept in restraints? That's preposterous. Is it? How many nights do you recall? Lisbeth Salander was an extremely aggressive and violence-prone patient, and undoubtedly she was placed in a stimulus-free room on a number of occasions. Perhaps I should explain the purpose of a stimulus-free room. Thank you, that won't be necessary. According to theory, it is a room in which a patient is denied any sensory input that might provoke agitation. For how many days and nights did 13-year-old Lisbeth Salander lie strapped down in such a room? It would be, I would estimate, perhaps on 30 occasions during the time she was at the hospital. 30. Now that's only a fraction of the 380 that she claims. Undeniably. Not even 10% of her figure. Yes? Would her medical records perhaps give us more accurate information? It's possible. Excellent, Giannini said, taking out a large sheaf of paper from her briefcase. Then I ask to be allowed to hand over to the court a copy of Lisbeth Salander's medical records from St. Stephen's. I have counted the number of notes about the restraining straps and find that the figure is 381, one more than my client claims. Teleborian's eyes widened. Stop, this is classified information. Where did you get that from? I got it from a reporter at Millennium magazine. It can hardly be classified if it's lying around a newspaper's offices. Perhaps I should add that extracts from these medical records were published today in Millennium. I believe, therefore, that even this district court should have the opportunity to look at the records themselves. This is illegal. No, it isn't. Lisbeth Salander has given her permission for the extracts to be published. My client has nothing to hide. Your client has been declared incompetent and has no right to make any such decision for herself. We'll come back to the declaration of incompetence. But first we need to examine what happened to her at St. Stephen's. Judge Iverson frowned as he accepted the papers that Giannini handed to him. I haven't made a copy for the prosecutor. He received a copy of this privacy-invading document more than a month ago. How did that happen? the judge said. Prosecutor Ekstrom got a copy of these classified records from Teleborian at a meeting which took place in his office at 5:00 p.m. on Saturday, June 4th, this year. Is that correct? Judge Iverson said. Ekstrom's first impulse was to deny it. Then he realized that Giannini might somehow have evidence. I requested permission to read parts of the records if I signed a confidentiality agreement, Ekstrom said. I had to make sure that Salander had the history she was alleged to have. Thank you, Giannini said. This means that we now have confirmation that Dr. Teleborian not only tells lies but also broke the law by disseminating records that he himself claims are classified. Duly noted, said the judge. Judge Iverson was suddenly very alert. In a most unorthodox way, Giannini had launched a serious attack on a witness, and she had already made mincemeat of an important part of his testimony. And she claims that she can document everything she says. Judge Iverson adjusted his glasses. Dr. Teleborian, based on these records which you yourself wrote, could you now tell me how many days Lisbeth Salander was kept in restraints? I have no recollection that it could have been so extensive, but if that's what the records say, then I have to believe it. A total of 381 days and nights. Does that not strike you as excessive? It is unusual, yes. How would you perceive it if you were 13 years old and someone strapped you to a steel-framed bed for more than a year? Would it feel like torture? You have to understand that the patient was dangerous to herself as well as to others. Okay. Let's look at whether she was dangerous to herself. Has Lisbeth Salander ever injured herself? There were such misgivings. I'll repeat the question. Has Lisbeth Salander ever injured herself? Yes or no? As psychiatrists, we must teach ourselves to interpret the overall picture. With regard to Lisbeth Salander, you can see on her body, for example, a multitude of tattoos and piercings, which are a form of self-destructive behavior and a way of damaging one's own body. We can interpret that as a manifestation of self-hate. Giannini turned to Salander. Are your tattoos a manifestation of self-hate? She said. No, Salander said. Giannini turned back to Teleborian. So you believe that I am also dangerous to myself because I wear earrings and actually have a tattoo in a private place? Palmgren snickered, but he managed to transform the snicker into a clearing of his throat. No, not at all. Tattoos can also be part of a social ritual. Are you saying that Lisbeth Salander is not part of this social ritual? You can see for yourself that her tattoos are grotesque and extend over large parts of her body. That is no normal measure of fetishism or body decoration. What percentage? Excuse me? At what percentage of tattooed body surface does it stop being fetishism and become a mental illness? You're distorting my words. Am I? How is it that, in your opinion, it is part of a wholly acceptable social ritual when it applies to me or to other young people, but it becomes dangerous when it's a matter of evaluating my client's mental state? As a psychiatrist, I have to look at the whole picture. The tattoos are merely an indicator. As I have already said, it is one of many indicators which need to be taken into account when I evaluate her condition. Giannini was silent for a few seconds as she fixed Teleborian with her gaze. She now spoke very slowly. But drive. Teleborian, you began strapping down my client when she was 12 years old, going on 13. At that time she did not have a single tattoo, did she? Teleborian hesitated, and Giannini went on. I presume that you did not strap her down because you predicted that she would begin tattooing herself sometime in the future. Of course not. Her tattoos had nothing to do with her condition in 1991. With that, we are back to my original question. Did Lisbeth Salander ever injure herself in a way that would justify keeping her bound to a bed for a whole year? For example, did she cut herself with a knife or a razor blade or anything like that? Teleborian looked unsure for a second. No, I used the tattoos as an example of self-destructive behavior. And we have just agreed that tattoos are a legitimate part of a social ritual. I asked why you restrained her for a year, and you replied that it was because she was a danger to herself. We had reason to believe that she was a danger to herself. Reason to believe, so you're saying that you restrained her because you guessed something? We carried out assessments. I have now been asking the same question for about 5 minutes. You claim that my client's self-destructive behavior was one reason why she was strapped down for a total of more than a year out of the 2 years she was in your care. Can you please finally give me some examples of the self-destructive behavior she evidenced at the age of 12? The girl was extremely undernourished, for example. This was partially due to the fact that she refused food. We suspected anorexia. I see. Was she anorexic? As you can see, my client is even today uncommonly thin and fine-boned. Well, it's difficult to answer that question. I would have to observe her eating habits for quite a long time. You did observe her eating habits for 2 years. And now you're suggesting that you confused anorexia with the fact that my client is small and thin. You say that she refused food. We were compelled to force feed her on several occasions. And why was that? Because she refused to eat, of course. Giannini turned to her client. Lisbeth, is it true that you refused to eat at St. Stephan's? Yes. And why was that? Because that bastard was mixing psychotropic drugs into my food. I see. So drive. Teleborian wanted to give you medicine. Why didn't you want to take it? I didn't like the medicine I was being given. It made me sluggish. I couldn't think, and I was sedated for most of the time I was awake. And the bastard refused to tell me what the drugs contained. So you refused to take the medicine? Yes. Then he began putting the crap in my food instead. So I stopped eating. Every time something had been put in my food, I stopped eating for 5 days. So you had to go hungry? Not always. Several of the attendants smuggled sandwiches into me on various occasions. One in particular gave me food late at night. That happened quite often. So you think that the nursing staff at St. Stephan's saw that you were hungry and gave you food so that you would not have to starve? That was during the period when I was battling with this bastard over psychotropic drugs. Tell us what happened. He tried to drug me. I refused to take his medicine. He started putting it in my food. I refused to eat. He started force-feeding me. I began vomiting up the food. So there was a completely rational reason why you refused the food. Yes. It was not because you didn't want food? No. I was often hungry. And since you left St. Stephan's, do you eat regularly? I eat when I'm hungry. Would it be correct to say that a conflict arose between you and Dr. Teleborian? You could say that. You were sent to St. Stephan's because you had thrown gasoline at your father and set him on fire. Yes. Why did you do that? Because he abused my mother. Did you ever explain that to anyone? Yes. And who was that? I told the police who interviewed me, the social workers, the doctors, a pastor, and that bastard. By that bastard, you are referring to ? Quote. That man. She pointed at Drive. Teleborian. Why do you call him a bastard? When I first arrived at St. Stephen's, I tried to explain to him what had happened. And what did Drive Teleborian say? He didn't want to listen to me. He claimed that I was fantasizing. And as punishment I was to be strapped down until I stopped fantasizing. And then he tried to force feed me psychotropic drugs. This is nonsense, Teleborian said. Is that why you won't speak to him? I haven't said a word to the bastard since the night I turned 13. I was strapped to the bed. It was my birthday present to myself. Giannini turned to Teleborian. This sounds as if the reason my client refused to eat was that she did not want the psychotropic drugs you were forcing upon her. It's possible that she views it that way. And how do you view it? I had a patient who was abnormally difficult. I maintain that her behavior showed that she was a danger to herself, but this might be a question of interpretation. However, she was violent and exhibited psychotic behavior. There is no doubt that she was dangerous to others. She came to St. Stephen's after she tried to murder her father. We'll get to that later. For 381 of those days you kept her in restraints. Could it have been that you used strapping as a way to punish my client when she didn't do as you said? That is utter nonsense. Is it? I noticed that according to the records the majority of the strapping occurred during the first year. 320 of 381 instances. Why was the strapping discontinued? I suppose the patient changed her behavior and became less agitated. Is it not true that your measures were considered unnecessarily brutal by other members of the staff? How do you mean? Is it not true that the staff lodged complaints against the force-feeding of Lisbeth Salander, among other things? Inevitably people will arrive at differing evaluations. This is nothing unusual. But it became a burden to force-feed her because she resisted so violently. Because she refused to take psychotropic drugs which made her listless and passive. She had no problem eating when she was not being drugged. Wouldn't that have been a more reasonable method of treatment than resorting to forcible measures? If you don't mind my saying so, Fru Giannini, I am actually a physician. I suspect that my medical expertise is rather more extensive than yours. It is my job to determine what medical treatments should be employed. It's true, I'm not a physician, Dr. Teleborian. However, I am not entirely lacking in expertise. Besides my qualifications as a lawyer, I was also trained as a psychologist at Stockholm University. This is necessary background training in my profession. You could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. Both Ekstrom and Teleborian stared in astonishment at Giannini. She continued inexorably. Is it not correct that your methods of treating my client eventually resulted in serious disagreements between you and your superior, Drive Johannes Kalden, head physician at the time? No, that is not correct. Dr. Kalden passed away several years ago and cannot give testimony. But here in court we have someone who met Drive Kalden on several occasions. Namely, my assistant counsel, Holger Palmgren. She turned to him. Can you tell us how that came about? Palmgren cleared his throat. He still suffered from the after effects of his stroke and had to concentrate to pronounce the words. I was appointed as trustee for Lisbeth Salander after her mother was so severely beaten by Lisbeth's father that she was disabled and could no longer take care of her daughters. She suffered permanent brain damage and repeated brain hemorrhages. You're speaking of Alexander Zalachenko, I presume. Ekstrom was leaning forward attentively. That's correct, Palmgren said. Ekstrom said, I would ask you to remember that we are now on a subject which is highly classified. It's hardly a secret that Alexander Zalachenko persistently abused Lisbeth's mother, Giannini said. Teleborian raised his hand. The matter is probably not quite as self-evident as Fru Giannini is presenting it. What do you mean by that? Giannini said. There is no doubt that Lisbeth Salander witnessed a family tragedy, that something triggered a serious beating in 1991. But there is no documentation to suggest that this was a situation that went on for many years, as Fru Giannini claims. It could have been an isolated incident or a quarrel that got out of hand. If truth be told, there is not even any documentation to point towards Herr Zalachenko as Lisbeth's mother's aggressor. We have been informed that she was a prostitute, so there could have been a number of other possible perpetrators. Giannini looked in astonishment at Teleborian. She seemed to be speechless for a moment. Then her eyes bored into him. Could you expand on that? She said. What I mean is that in practice we have only Lisbeth Salander's assertions to go on. And? First of all, there were two sisters. Twins, in fact. Camilla Salander has never made any such claims. Indeed, she has denied that such a thing occurred. And if there was abuse to the extent your client maintains, then it would naturally have been noted in social welfare reports and so forth. Is there an interview with Camilla Salander that we might examine? Interview? Do you have any documentation to show that Camilla Salander was even asked about what occurred at their home? Salander squirmed in her seat at the mention of her sister. She glanced at Giannini. I presume that the Social Welfare Agency filed a report. You have just stated that Camilla Salander never made any assertions that Alexander Zalachenko abused their mother, that on the contrary she denied it. That was a categorical statement. Where did you get that information? Teleborian sat in silence for several seconds. Giannini could see his eyes change when he realized he had made a mistake. He could anticipate what it was that she wanted to introduce, but there was no way to avoid the question. I seem to remember that it appeared in the police report, he said at last. You seem to remember. I myself have searched high and low for police reports about the incident on Lundagaten during which Alexander Zalachenko was severely burned. The only ones available are the brief reports written by the officers at the scene. That's possible. So I would very much like to know how it is that you were able to read a police report that is not available to the defense. I can't answer that, Teleborian said. I was shown the report in 1991 when I wrote a forensic psychiatric report on your client after the attempted murder of her father. Was Prosecutor Ekstrom shown this report? Ekstrom squirmed. He stroked his goatee. By now he knew that he had underestimated Advocate Giannini. However, he had no reason to lie. Yes, I've seen it. Why wasn't the defense given access to this material? I didn't consider it of interest to the trial. Could you please tell me how you were allowed to see this report? When I asked the police, I was told only that no such report exists. The report was written by the security police. It's classified. So Sapo wrote a report on a case involving aggravated assault on a woman and decided to make the report classified. It was because of the perpetrator, Alexander Zalachenko. He was a political refugee. Who wrote the report? Silence. I don't hear anything. What name was on the title page? It was written by Gunnar Bjork from the Immigration Division of SIS. Thank you. Is that the same Gunnar Bjork who my client claims worked with Dr. Teleborian to fabricate the forensic psychiatric report about her in 1991? I assume it is. Giannini turned her attention back to Teleborian. In 1991 you committed Lisbeth Salander to the secure ward of St. Stephan's Children's Psychiatric Clinic. That's not correct. Is it not? No. Lisbeth Salander was sentenced to the secure psychiatric ward. This was the outcome of an entirely routine legal action in a district court. We're talking about a seriously disturbed minor. That was not my own decision. In 1991, a district court decided to lock up Lisbeth Salander in a children's psychiatric clinic. Why did the district court make that decision? The district court made a careful assessment of your client's actions and mental condition. She had tried to murder her father with a gasoline bomb, after all. This is not an activity that a normal teenager would engage in, whether they are tattooed or not. Teleborian gave her a polite smile. And what did the district court base their judgment on? If I've understood correctly, they had only one forensic medical assessment to go on. It was written by yourself and a policeman by the name of Gunnar Bjork. This is about Fröken Salander's conspiracy theories, Fru Giannini. Here I would have two. Excuse me, but I haven't asked a question yet, Giannini said and turned once again to Palmgren. Holger, we were talking about your meeting drive. Teleborian's superior, drive. Calden. Yes. In my capacity as trustee for Lisbeth Salander. At that stage one had met her only very briefly. Like everyone else, I got the impression that she had a serious mental illness. But since it was my job, I undertook to research her general state of health. And what did Drive Calden say? She was Dr. Teleborian's patient and doctor. Calden had not paid her any particular attention except in routine assessments and the like. It wasn't until she had been there for more than a year that I began to discuss how she could be rehabilitated back into society. I suggested a foster family. I don't know exactly what went on internally at St. Stephan's, but after about a year drive, Calden began to take an interest in her. How did that manifest itself? I discovered that he had arrived at an opinion that differed from Dr. Teleborian's, Palmgren said. He told me once that he had decided to change the type of care she was receiving. I did not understand until later that he was referring to the strap restraints. Dr. Calden had decided that she should not be restrained. He didn't think there was any reason for it. So he went against Drive Teleborian's directives? Ekstrom interrupted. Objection. That's hearsay. No, Palmgren said. Not entirely. I asked for a report on how Lisbeth Salander was supposed to re-enter society. Dr. Calden wrote that report. I still have it today. He handed a document to Giannini. Can you tell us what it says? It's a letter from Dr. Calden to me dated October 1992, which is when Lisbeth had been at St. Stephan's for 19 months. Here Drive Calden expressly writes, I quote, my decision for the patient not to be restrained or force-fed has also produced the noticeable effect that she is now calm. There is no need for psychotropic drugs. However, the patient is extremely withdrawn and uncommunicative and needs continued supportive therapies. End quote. So he expressly writes that it was his decision, Giannini said. That is correct. It was also Drive Calden himself who decided that Lisbeth should be able to re-enter society by being placed with a foster family. Salander nodded. She remembered Drive Calden the same way she remembered every detail of her stay at St. Stephan's. She had refused to talk to Dr. Calden. He was a crazy doctor, another man in a white coat who wanted to root around in her emotions. But he had been friendly and good-natured. She had sat in his office and listened to him when he explained things to her. He had seemed hurt when she did not want to speak to him. Finally she had looked him in the eye and explained her decision. I will never ever talk to you or any other crazy doctor. None of you listen to what I have to say. You can keep me locked up here until I die. That won't change a thing. I won't talk to any of you. He had looked at her with surprise and hurt in his eyes. Then he had nodded as if he understood. Dr. Teleborian, Giannini said, we have established that you had Lisbeth Salander committed to a children's psychiatric clinic. You were the one who furnished the district court with the report, and this report constituted the only basis for the decisions that were made. Is this correct? That is essentially correct. But I think. You'll have plenty of time to explain what you think. When Lisbeth Salander was about to turn 18, you once again interfered in her life and tried to have her locked up in a clinic. This time I wasn't the one who wrote the forensic medical report. No, it was written by Dr. Jesper H. Loderman, a doctoral candidate at that time. And you just happened to be his supervisor. So it was your assessments that caused the report to be approved. There's nothing unethical or incorrect in these reports. They were done according to the proper regulations of my profession. Now Lisbeth Salander is 27 years old, and for the third time we are in a situation in which you are trying to convince a district court that she is mentally ill and must be committed to a secure psychiatric ward. Teleborian took a deep breath. Giannini was well prepared. She had surprised him with a number of tricky questions, and she had succeeded in distorting his replies. She had not fallen for his charms, and she completely ignored his authority. He was used to having people nod in agreement when he spoke. How much does she know? He glanced at Prosecutor Ekstrom but realized that he could expect no help from that quarter. He had to ride out the storm alone. He reminded himself that, in spite of everything, he was an authority. It doesn't matter what she says. It's my assessment that counts. Giannini picked up his forensic psychiatric report. Let's take a closer look at your latest report. You expend a great deal of energy analyzing Lisbeth Salander's emotional life. A large part deals with your interpretation of her personality, her behavior, and her sexual habits. In this report I have attempted to give a complete picture. Good. And based on this complete picture you came to the conclusion that Lisbeth suffers from paranoid schizophrenia. I prefer not to restrict myself to a precise diagnosis. But you have not reached this conclusion through conversations with my client, have you? You know very well that your client resolutely refuses to answer questions that I or any other person in authority might put to her. This behavior is in itself particularly telling. One can conclude that the patient's paranoid traits have progressed to such an extent that she is literally incapable of having a simple conversation with anyone in authority. She believes that everyone is out to harm her and feels so threatened that she shuts herself inside an impenetrable shell and goes mute. I notice that you're expressing yourself very carefully. You say, for example, that one can conclude. Yes, that's right. I am expressing myself carefully. Psychiatry is not an exact science, and I must be careful with my conclusions. At the same time, it is not true that we psychiatrists sit around making assumptions that have no basis in fact. What you are being very precise about is protecting yourself. The literal fact is that you have not exchanged one single word with my client since the night of her 13th birthday because she has refused to talk to you. Not only to me. She appears unable to have a conversation with any psychiatrist. This means that, as you write here, your conclusions are based on experience and on observations of my client. That's right. What can you learn by studying a girl who sits on a chair with her arms crossed and refuses to talk to you? Teleborian sighed as though he thought it was irksome to have to explain the obvious. He smiled. From a patient who sits and says nothing, you can learn only that this is a patient who is good at sitting and saying nothing. Even this is disturbed behavior, but that's not what I'm basing my conclusions on. Later this afternoon I will call upon another psychiatrist. His name is Svante Brandian, and he's senior physician at the Institute of Forensic Medicine and a specialist in forensic psychiatry. Do you know him? Teleborian felt confident again. He had expected Giannini to call upon another psychiatrist to question his own conclusions. It was a situation for which he was ready, and in which he would be able to dismiss every objection without difficulty. Indeed, it would be easier to handle an academic colleague in a friendly debate than someone like Advocate Giannini, who had no inhibitions and was bent on distorting his words. He smiled. He is a highly respected and skilled forensic psychiatrist. But you must understand, Fru Giannini, that producing a report of this type is an academic and scientific process. You may disagree with my conclusions, and another psychiatrist may interpret an action or an event in a different way. You may have dissimilar points of view, or perhaps it would be a question purely of how well one doctor or another knows the patient. He might arrive at a very different conclusion about Lisbeth Salander. That is not at all unusual in psychiatry. That's not why I'm calling him. He has not met or examined Lisbeth Salander, and he will not be making any evaluations about her mental condition. Oh, is that so? I have asked him to read your report and all the documentation you have produced on Lisbeth Salander and to look at her medical records from St. Stephan's. I have asked him to make an assessment, not about the state of my client's health, but about whether, from a purely scientific point of view, there is adequate foundation for your conclusions in the material you recorded. Teleborian shrugged. With all due respect, I think I have a better understanding of Lisbeth Salander than any other psychiatrist in the country. I have followed her development since she was 12, and regrettably my conclusions were always confirmed by her actions. Very well, Giannini said. Then we'll take a look at your conclusions. In your statement you write that her treatment was interrupted when she was placed with a foster family at the age of 15. That's correct. It was a serious mistake. If we had been allowed to complete the treatment, we might not be here in this courtroom today. You mean that if you had had the opportunity to keep her in restraints for another year, she might have become more tractable? That is unfair. I do beg your pardon. You cite extensively the report that your doctoral candidate Jesper Loderman put together when Lisbeth Salander was about to turn 18. You write that, quote, her self-destructive and antisocial behavior is confirmed by drug abuse and the promiscuity which she has exhibited since she was discharged from St. Stephan's, unquote. What did you mean by this statement? Teleborian sat in silence for several seconds. Well, now I'll have to go back a bit. After Lisbeth Salander was discharged from St. Stephan's, she developed, as I had predicted, problems with alcohol and drug abuse. She was repeatedly arrested by the police. A social welfare report also determined that she had had profligate sexual relations with older men and that she was very probably involved in prostitution. Let's analyze this. You say that she abused alcohol. How often was she intoxicated? I'm sorry? Was she drunk every day from when she was released until she turned 18? Was she drunk once a week? Naturally, I can't answer that. But you have just stated that she had problems with alcohol abuse. She was a minor and arrested repeatedly by the police for drunkenness. That's the second time you have said that she was arrested repeatedly. How often did this occur? Was it once a week or once every other week? It's not a matter of so many individual occasions. Lisbeth Salander was arrested on 2 occasions for drunkenness when she was 17. She was so blind drunk that she was taken to the hospital. These are the repeated arrests you refer to. Was she intoxicated on more than these occasions? I don't know, but one might fear that her behavior was. Excuse me, did I hear you correctly? You do not know whether she was intoxicated on more than 2 occasions during her teenage years, but you fear that this was the case. And yet you write reports maintaining that Lisbeth Salander was engaged in repeated alcohol and drug abuse? That is the social services information, not mine. It has to do with Lisbeth Salander's whole lifestyle. Not surprisingly, her prognosis was dismal after her treatment was interrupted, and her life became a round of alcohol abuse, police intervention, and uncontrolled promiscuity. You say, uncontrolled promiscuity. Quote. Yes. That's a term which indicates that she had no control over her own life. She had sexual relations with older men. That's not against the law. No, but it's abnormal behavior for a 17-year-old girl. The question might be asked as to whether she participated in such encounters of her own free will or whether she was in a situation of uncontrollable compulsion. But you said that she was very probably a prostitute. That may have been a natural consequence of the fact that she lacked education, was incapable of completing school or continuing on to higher education, and therefore could not get a job. It's possible that she viewed older men as father figures and that financial remuneration for sexual favors was simply a convenient bonus. In which case I perceive it as neurotic behavior. So you think that a 17-year-old girl who has sex is neurotic? You're twisting my words. But you do not know whether she ever took money for sexual favors. She was never arrested for prostitution. And she hardly could be, since prostitution is not a crime in our country. Well, yes, that's right. In her case, this has to do with compulsive neurotic behavior. And you did not hesitate to conclude that Lisbeth Salander is mentally ill based on these unverifiable assumptions? When I was 16 years old, I drank myself silly on half a bottle of vodka which I stole from my father. Do you think that makes me mentally ill? No, of course not. If I may be so bold, is it not a fact that when you were 17 you went to a party and got so drunk that you and your friends went out on the town and smashed the windows around the square in Uppsala? You were arrested by the police, detained until you were sober, and then let off with a fine. Teleborian looked shocked. Is that not a fact, Drive? Teleborian? Well, yes. People do so many stupid things when they're 17. But that doesn't lead you, or anyone else, to believe that you have a serious mental illness? Teleborian was angry. That infernal lawyer kept twisting his words and homing in on details. She refused to see the larger picture. And his own childish escapade. How the hell had she gotten a hold of that information? He cleared his throat and spoke in a raised voice. The reports from social services were unequivocal. They confirmed that Lisbeth Salander had a lifestyle that revolved around alcohol, drugs, and promiscuity. Social services also said that she was a prostitute. No, social services never said that she was a prostitute. She was arrested at. No, she was not arrested, Giannini said. She was searched in London at the age of 17 when she was in the company of a much older man. That same year she was arrested for drunkenness, also in the company of a much older man. Social services feared that she might be engaged in prostitution. But no evidence was ever presented. She had very loose sexual relations with a large number of individuals, both male and female. In your own report, you dwell on my client's sexual habits. You claim that her relationship with her friend Miriam Wu confirms the misgivings about a sexual psychopathy. Why does it confirm any such thing? Teleborian gave no answer. I sincerely hope that you are not thinking of claiming that homosexuality is a mental illness, Giannini said. That might even be an illegal statement. No, of course not. I'm alluding to the elements of sexual sadism in the relationship. You think that she's a sadist? We have Miriam Wu's statement here. There was, it says, no violence in their relationship. They engaged in S&M sex and. Now I'm beginning to think you've been reading too many evening newspapers. Lisbeth Salander and her friend Miriam Wu engaged in sexual games on some occasions which involved Miriam Wu tying up my client and giving her sexual satisfaction. That is neither especially unusual nor against the law. Is that why you want to lock up my client? Teleborian waved a hand in a dismissive gesture. When I was 16 and still at school, I was intoxicated on a good many occasions. I have tried drugs. I have smoked marijuana, and I even tried cocaine on one occasion about 20 years ago. I had my first sexual experience with a school friend when I was 15, and I had a relationship with a boy who tied my hands to the bedposts when I was 20. When I was 22, I had a relationship with a man who was 47 that lasted several months. Am I, in your view, mentally ill? Fru Giannini, you joke about this, but your sexual experiences are irrelevant in this case. Why is that? When I read your so-called psychiatric assessment of Lisbeth Salander, I find point after point which, taken out of context, would apply to myself. Why am I healthy and sound while Lisbeth Salander is considered a dangerous sadist? These are not the details that are relevant. You didn't twice try to murder your father. Doctor. Teleborian, the reality is that it's none of your business whom Lisbeth Salander wants to have sex with. It's none of your business which gender her partner is or how they conduct their sexual relations. And yet in her case you pluck out details from her life and use them as the basis for saying that she is sick. Lisbeth Salander's whole life, from the time she was in junior school, is a document of unprovoked and violent outbursts of anger against teachers and other pupils. Just a moment, Giannini's voice was suddenly like an ice scraper on a car window. Look at my client. Everyone looked at Salander. My client grew up in abominable family circumstances. Over a period of years her father persistently abused her mother. Let me finish. Lisbeth Salander's mother was mortally afraid of Alexander Zalachenko. She did not dare to protest. She did not dare to go to a doctor. She did not dare to go to a women's crisis center. She was ground down and eventually beaten so badly that she suffered irreversible brain damage. The person who had to take responsibility, the only person who tried to take responsibility for the family long before she reached her teens even, was Lisbeth Salander. She had to shoulder that burden all by herself, since Zalachenko the spy was more important to the state and its social services than Lisbeth's mother. I cannot. The result, was a situation in which society abandoned Lisbeth's mother and her 2 children. Are you surprised that Lisbeth had problems at school? Look at her. She's small and skinny. She has always been the smallest girl in her class. She was introverted and eccentric, and she had no friends. Do you know how children tend to treat fellow students who are different? Teleborian sighed. Giannini continued. I can go back to her school records and examine one situation after another in which Lisbeth turned violent. The incidents were always preceded by some kind of provocation. I can easily recognize the signs of bullying. Let me tell you something. What? I admire Lisbeth Salander. She's tougher than I am. If I had been strapped down for a year when I was 13, I would probably have broken down altogether. She fought back with the only weapon she had available, her contempt for you. Her nervousness was long gone. She felt that she was in control. In your testimony this morning you spoke a great deal about fantasies. You stated, for instance, that Lisbeth Salander's account of her rape by Advocate Bierman is a fantasy. That's correct. On what do you base your conclusion? On my experience of the way she usually fantasizes. On your experience of the way she usually fantasizes? How do you decide when she is fantasizing? When she says that she was strapped to a bed for 380 days and nights, in your opinion it's a fantasy, despite the fact that your very own records tell us that this was indeed the case. This is something entirely different. There is not a shred of evidence that Bierman committed rape against Lisbeth Salander. I mean, needles through her nipples and such gross violence that she unquestionably should have been taken by ambulance to the hospital. It's obvious that this could not have taken place. Giannini turned to Judge Iverson. I asked to have a projector available today. It's in place, the judge said. Could we close the curtains, please? Giannini opened her PowerBook and plugged in the cables to the projector. She turned to her client. Lisbeth, we're going to look at the film. Are you ready for this? I lived through it, Salander said dryly. And I have your approval to show it here? Salander nodded. She fixed her eyes on Teleborian. Can you tell us when the film was made? On March 7, 2003. Who shot the film? I did. I used a hidden camera, standard equipment at Milton Security. Just one moment, Prosecutor Ekstrom shouted. This is beginning to resemble a circus act. What is it we are about to see? Judge Iverson said with a sharp edge to his voice. Dr. Teleborian claims that Lisbeth Salander's account of her rape by Advocate Bierman is a fantasy. I am going to show you evidence to the contrary. The film is 90 minutes long, but I will show only a few short excerpts. I warn you that it contains some very unpleasant scenes. Is this some sort of trick? Ekstrom said. There's a good way to find out, said Janini and started the DVD in her laptop. Haven't you even learned to tell the time? Advocate Bierman greets Salander gruffly. The camera enters his apartment. After 9 minutes, Judge Iverson banged his gavel. Advocate Bierman was being shown violently shoving a dildo into Lisbeth Salander's anus. Janini had turned up the volume. Salander's half-stifled screams through the duct tape that covered her mouth were heard throughout the courtroom. Turn off the film, Judge Iverson said in a very loud and commanding voice. Janini pressed stop, and the ceiling lights were turned back on. Judge Iverson was red in the face. Prosecutor Ekstrom sat as if turned to stone. Teleborian was as pale as a corpse. Advocate Janini, how long is this film, did you say? 90 minutes. The rape itself went on in stages for about 5 or 6 hours, but my client has only a vague sense of the violence inflicted upon her in the last few hours. Janini turned to Teleborian. There is a scene, however, in which Bierman pushes a needle through my client's nipple, something that Dr. Teleborian maintains is an expression of Lisbeth Salander's wild imagination. It takes place in minute 72, and I'm offering to show the episode here and now. Thank you, that won't be necessary, the judge said. Froken Salander. For a second he lost his train of thought and did not know how to proceed. Froken Salander, why did you record this film? Bierman had already subjected me to 1 rape and was demanding more. The first time, he made me blow him, the old creep. I thought it was going to be a repeat. I thought I'd be able to get such good evidence of what he did that I could then blackmail him into staying away from me. I misjudged him. But why did you not go to the police when you have such irrefutable evidence? I don't talk to policemen, Salander said flatly. Palmgren stood up from his wheelchair. He supported himself by leaning on the edge of the table. His voice was very clear. Our client on principle does not speak to the police or to other persons of authority, and least of all to psychiatrists. The reason is simple. From the time she was a child she tried time and again to talk to police and social workers to explain that her mother was being abused by Alexander Zalachenko. The result in every instance was that she was punished because government civil servants had decided that Zalachenko was more important than she was. He cleared his throat and continued. And when she eventually concluded that nobody was listening to her, her only means of protecting her mother was to fight Zalachenko with violence. And then this bastard who calls himself a doctor, he pointed at Teleborian, wrote a fabricated psychiatric diagnosis which described her as mentally ill, and it gave him the opportunity to keep her in restraints at St. Stephan's for 380 days. What a bastard. Palmgren sat down. Judge Iverson was surprised by this outburst. He turned to Salander. Would you perhaps like to take a break? ? Why? Salander said. All right, then we'll continue. Advocate Janini, the recording will be examined, and I will require a technical opinion to verify its authenticity. But I cannot tolerate seeing any more of these appalling scenes at present. Let's proceed. Gladly. I too find them appalling, said Janini. My client has been subjected to multiple instances of physical and mental abuse and legal misconduct. And the person most to blame for this is Dr. Peter Teleborian. He betrayed his oath as a physician, and he betrayed his patient. Together with a member of an illegal group within the security police, Gunnar Bjork, he patched together a forensic psychiatric assessment for the purpose of locking up an inconvenient witness. I believe that this case must be unique in Swedish jurisprudence. These are outrageous accusations, Teleborian said. I have done my best to help Lisbeth Salander. She tried to murder her father. It's perfectly obvious that there's something wrong with her. Janini interrupted him. I would now like to bring to the attention of the court drive Teleborian's second forensic psychiatric assessment of my client, presented at this trial today. I maintain that it is a lie, just as the report from 1991 was a lie. Well, this is simply, Teleborian spluttered. Judge Iverson, could you please ask the witness to stop interrupting me? Herr Teleborian. I will be quiet. But these are outrageous accusations. It's not surprising that I'm upset. Herr Teleborian, please be quiet until a question is directed to you. Go on, Advocate Giannini. This is the forensic psychiatric assessment that Dr. Teleborian has presented to the court. It is based on what he has termed observations of my client, which were supposed to have taken place after she was moved to Kronoberg prison on June 5. The examination was supposed to have been concluded on July 5. Yes, so I have understood, Judge Iverson said. Dr. Teleborian, is it the case that you did not have the opportunity to examine or observe my client before June 6? Before that, she was at Sahlgrenska Hospital in Göteborg, where she was being kept in isolation, as we know. Yes. You made attempts on 2 separate occasions to gain access to my client at Sahlgrenska. Both times you were denied admittance. Giannini opened her briefcase and took out a document. She walked around her table and handed it to Judge Iverson. I see, the judge said. This appears to be a copy of Dr. Teleborian's report. What is your point? I would like to call 2 witnesses. They are waiting outside the courtroom now. Who are these witnesses? They are Michael Blomqvist from Millennium magazine and Superintendent Torsten Edklunth, Director of the Constitutional Protection Unit of the Security Police. And they are outside? Yes. Show them in, Judge Iverson said. This is highly irregular, Prosecutor Ekstrom said. Ekstrom had watched in extreme discomfort as Giannini shredded his key witness. The film was devastating evidence. The judge ignored Ekstrom and gestured to the bailiff to open the door to admit Blomqvist and Edklunth. I would first like to call Michael Blomqvist. Then I would ask that Herr Teleborian stand down for a while, Judge Iverson said. Are you finished with me? Teleborian said. No, not by any means, Giannini said. Blomqvist replaced Teleborian in the witness box. Judge Iverson swiftly dealt with the formalities, and Blomqvist took the oath. Michael, Giannini said, and then she smiled. I would find it difficult, if your honor will forgive me, to call my brother Herr Blomqvist, so I will settle for his first name. She went to Judge Iverson's bench and asked for the forensic psychiatric report which she had just handed to him. She then gave it to Blomqvist. Have you seen this document before? Yes, I have. I have 3 versions in my possession. The first I acquired on May 12th, the second on May 19th, and the third, this one, on June 3rd. Can you tell us how you acquired the copies? I received them in my capacity as a journalist from a source I do not intend to name. Salander stared at Teleborian. He was once more deathly pale. What did you do with the report? I gave it to Torsten Edklunth at Constitutional Protection. Thank you, Michael. Now I'd like to call Torsten Edklunth, Giannini said, taking back the report. She handed it to Judge Iverson, and the procedure with the oath was repeated. Superintendent Edklunth, is it correct that you received a forensic psychiatric report on Lisbeth Salander from Michael Blomqvist? Yes, it is. When did you receive it? It was logged in at SIS on June 4th. And this is the same report I have just handed to Judge Iverson? If my signature is on the back, then it's the same one. The judge turned over the document and saw Edklunth's signature there. Superintendent Edklunth, could you explain how you happen to have a forensic psychiatric report in your possession which claims to have analyzed a patient who was still in isolation at Sahlgrenska? Yes, I can. Dr. Teleborian's report is a sham. It was put together with the help of a person by the name of Jonas Sandberg, just as he produced a similar document in 1991 with Gunnar Björk. That's a lie, Teleborian said in a weak voice. Is it a lie? Giannini said. No, not at all, Edklunth said. I should perhaps mention that Jonas Sandberg is one of a dozen or so individuals who were arrested today by order of the Prosecutor General. Sandberg is being held as an accomplice to the murder of Gunnar Björk. He is part of a criminal unit operating within the security police which has been protecting Alexander Zalachenko since the 70s. This same group of officers was responsible for the decision to lock up Lisbeth Salander in 1991. We have incontrovertible evidence, as well as a confession from the unit's director. The courtroom was hushed, transfixed. Wood Drive. Teleborian like to comment on what has just been said? Judge Iverson asked. Teleborian shook his head. In that case, it is my duty to tell you that you risk being charged with perjury and possibly other counts in addition, Judge Iverson said. If you'll excuse me, Your Honor, Blomkvist said. Yes? Doctor. Teleborian has bigger problems than this. Outside the courtroom are 2 police officers who would like to bring him in for questioning. I see, the judge said. Is it a matter which concerns this court? I believe it is, Your Honor. Judge Iverson gestured to the bailiff, who admitted Inspector Modig and a woman prosecutor Ekstrom did not immediately recognize. Her name was Lisa Calzo, and she was a criminal inspector for the Special Investigations Division, the unit within the National Police Board responsible for investigating cases of child pornography and sexual assault on children. And what is your business here? Judge Iverson said. We are here to arrest Peter Teleborian with your permission, and without wishing to disturb the court's proceedings. Judge Iverson looked at Advocate Giannini. I'm not quite finished with him, but the court may have heard enough of Dr. Teleborian. You have my permission, Judge Iverson said to the police officers. Calzo walked across to Teleborian. Peter Teleborian, you are under arrest for violation of the law on child pornography. Teleborian sat still, hardly breathing. Giannini saw that all the light in his eyes seemed to have been extinguished. Specifically, for possession of approximately 9,000 pornographic photographs of children found on your computer. She bent down to pick up his laptop, which he had brought with him. This is confiscated as evidence, she said. As he was being led from the courtroom, Salander's blazing eyes bored into Teleborian's back.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.